I'm going to tell you a story about architecture, ambition, and the kind of revenge that doesn't require you to raise your voice. It's about how I learned that the most devastating contracts aren't written in anger. They're written in absolute clarity, signed in confidence, and enforced with patience. My name is Adrian, and this is the story of how I turned grief into leverage, and how the person who tried to bury my career ended up signing away his own. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York, where nobody talked about design or aesthetics, or the relationship between space and human behavior. My father worked maintenance at a paper mill. My mother was a bookkeeper for a local credit union. They were good people who valued stability over dreams, practicality over vision. But I was different. From the time I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, I was obsessed with how things were built. Not just buildings, everything. I'd take apart alarm clocks to see how the components fit together. I'd study the way our neighbor's porch was constructed, noting the angle of the supports and the spacing of the railings. I'd sketch floor plans of imaginary houses on graph paper. I'd steal from my mother's office supplies. My parents didn't understand it, but they didn't discourage it either. They figured it was better than getting into trouble, which was what most kids in our town did for entertainment. By high school, I knew I wanted to study architecture, not construction, not engineering, architecture. The art and science of creating spaces that changed how people lived and worked and felt. My guidance counselor told me it was ambitious for someone from my background. She suggested I consider something more realistic, like civil engineering or surveying. I applied to architecture programs anyway. I got into 3 schools. The one I chose was a mid-tier university about 4 hours from home. Good enough to be respected, affordable enough that I could manage it with loans and a part-time job. My parents drove me there in late August, helped me move into a cramped dorm room that smelled like industrial cleaner, and left with minimal fanfare. My father shook my hand. My mother hugged me and told me to call once a week. Then they drove back to their small town and their predictable lives. And I was alone in a place where nobody knew me and nobody cared where I came from. It felt like freedom. I met Harrison Caldwell on the second day of orientation. We were in a mandatory introduction session for architecture students. About 60 of us packed into a lecture hall, all trying to look more confident than we felt. The department chair was explaining the program's philosophy, the curriculum structure, the legendary difficulty of the studio courses. Harrison was sitting 2 rows ahead of me, and I noticed him because he was asking questions. Not nervous questions or trying to impress the professor questions. Real questions, thoughtful ones, about the balance between creative freedom and technical constraints, about how the program approached sustainability and urban planning. After the session ended, I caught up with him in the hallway. "Those were good questions," I said. He turned and grinned. Harrison had one of those faces that made you want to trust him immediately. Warm eyes, easy smile, the kind of natural charisma that some people are just born with. "Thanks," he said. "I figured if I'm going to spend 4 years here, I should know what I'm getting into." We started talking, and within 10 minutes, I knew we were going to be friends. He was from Connecticut, from a family that was comfortable but not wealthy. His mother was a high school teacher. His father sold medical equipment. He'd known he wanted to be an architect since he was 12, when his family visited Barcelona, and he saw Gaudi's Sagrada Familia. "It changed everything for me," he said. "I realized buildings could be more than functional, they could be transformative." We grabbed coffee, then dinner, then ended up talking until nearly midnight about our favorite buildings, our design philosophies, what we wanted to accomplish. I told him about my small-town background, my parents' confusion about my career choice. He told me about the pressure his family put on him to pursue something more conventionally successful, law, medicine, business. "But I can't imagine doing anything else," he said. Can you? I couldn't. By the end of our first semester, Harrison and I were inseparable. We took the same classes, worked on projects together, spent countless hours in the studio critiquing each other's work. He had the vision and the presentation skills. He could sell an idea, make people believe in it, communicate the emotional impact of a design. I had the technical precision and the strategic thinking. I could solve the complex spatial problems, work out the structural systems, figure out how to make the impossible buildable. We complemented each other perfectly. The idea to start a firm together came up during our second year, late one night in the studio, when we were both exhausted from working on a particularly demanding project. We should do this for real someday, Harrison said, staring at the model we'd built. A mixed-use development that integrated residential, commercial, and public space in a way that felt innovative but grounded. Do what? I asked, though I knew what he meant. This. Open our own firm. Not work for some corporate architecture factory that churns out identical glass boxes. Actually create things that matter. I looked at our model, at the careful attention to human scale, the way we designed the ground floor to encourage street life and community interaction, the sustainable systems we'd integrated without making them feel like an afterthought. Yeah, I said, we should. From that point on, it wasn't just a dream, it was a plan. We started treating our academic projects as portfolio pieces. We attended lectures and networking events. We subscribed to industry publications. We began developing our own design philosophy, a coherent vision that would eventually define our firm. Harrison was brilliant at articulating what we believed in. He could stand in front of a jury and explain not just what we'd designed, but why it mattered, how it would improve people's lives, what it said about the relationship between architecture and society. I was the one who made sure it all actually worked. While Harrison was crafting the narrative, I was calculating structural loads, optimizing spatial efficiency, solving the technical challenges that could make or break a design. We were perfect partners. During the spring of our second year, we started developing what we called the Riverfront Project, an ambitious urban redevelopment concept for a fictional site. It was more than just a class assignment for us. It was our manifesto, the project that would eventually launch our firm. The concept was to transform an abandoned industrial waterfront into a vibrant, mixed-use district that preserved the area's historical character while creating new opportunities for housing, commerce, and public space. We spent months on it, refining every detail, developing comprehensive planning documents, creating renderings that showed how the space would function across different times of day and seasons. It was the best work either of us had ever done. Professor Davenport, who taught our urban design studio, called it exceptionally mature for second-year students and encouraged us to develop it further. We were planning to do exactly that, to continue refining it over the summer, maybe enter it in a student competition, use it as the foundation for our future firm's portfolio. We had everything planned out. Harrison died on a Friday night in April. He'd driven home to Connecticut for his younger sister's birthday. The weather was clear, the roads were dry. A drunk driver crossed the median on I-95 and hit him head-on at 60 miles per hour. The police said he died instantly. I got the call from his mother at 2 a.m. I was in the studio working late on a project that was due Monday. When my phone rang with an unknown number, I almost didn't answer. "Is this Adrian?" a woman's voice asked. She sounded hollow, like all the life had been drained out of her. "Yes," I said. "This is Eleanor Caldwell, Harrison's mother." The way she said Harrison's mother, past tense almost, like she was introducing herself as the mother of someone who no longer existed, made my stomach drop. "There's been an accident," she said. The next week was a blur. I drove to Connecticut for the funeral. I sat in the back of a crowded church and listened to people talk about Harrison like he was already a memory. His father gave a eulogy that focused on Harrison's charisma and charm, barely mentioning his actual passion for architecture. His sister read a poem that made everyone cry. I couldn't cry. I just sat there, numb, thinking about all the conversations we'd never have, all the buildings we'd never design, the firm we'd never open. After the funeral, Harrison's mother pulled me aside. Her eyes were red and swollen, but she held herself together with visible effort. "Harrison talked about you all the time," she said. "He always said you two were going to change the world together." She handed me a box. Inside were Harrison's sketchbooks, his drafting tools, and a flash drive containing all our shared project files. "He'd want you to have these," she said. "He'd want you to keep going." I drove back to campus with the box on my passenger seat, and for the entire 4-hour drive, I couldn't stop thinking about how unfair it was. Harrison was the face of our partnership, the one everyone noticed and remembered. I was supposed to be the supporting player, the technical guy who made Harrison's visions buildable. Now Harrison was gone, and I had a box full of blueprints and a future that suddenly felt impossible. I first became aware of Cameron Prescott during a studio critique about 2 weeks after Harrison's funeral. Cameron was in our year, in a different studio section. He was talented, not brilliant, but competent and ambitious. He had a tendency toward flashy designs that prioritized visual impact over spatial functionality, the kind of work that looked impressive in renderings, but would be difficult to actually build or inhabit. He was also intensely competitive. During the critique, one of our professors mentioned Harrison's death and acknowledged that it had been difficult for many of us. Cameron was standing near me, and I heard him mutter to another student, "Especially difficult for some people who just lost their meal ticket." I turned to look at him. He met my eyes with a slight smirk, then looked away. I should have confronted him right then. I should have said something, demanded to know what he meant. But I was still processing Harrison's death, still trying to figure out how to function in a world where my best friend and partner was suddenly gone. So I said nothing. That was my first mistake. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing a pattern. In casual conversations, in studio discussions, in group critiques, Cameron would make subtle comments that diminished my contributions to the work Harrison and I had done together. Harrison was really the creative force in that partnership. Adrian's more of a technical guy, good with the math and structural stuff. It's going to be tough for Adrian without Harrison's vision to guide him. None of it was overt enough to call out directly. None of it was explicitly cruel. But it was constant, and it was effective. By the end of the semester, I could feel the shift in how other students, and even some faculty members, perceived me. Where before I'd been seen as half of a promising partnership, now I was increasingly viewed as the lesser half, the support player who'd lost his star. The real damage came during the fall of our 3rd year. We had a major studio project, a cultural center design that would be presented to outside critics and industry professionals. It was the kind of project that could make or break your reputation within the program. I threw myself into it. Without Harrison, I had to prove that I could create visually compelling, conceptually strong work on my own. I spent weeks developing a design for a performing arts center that integrated flexible performance spaces with community gathering areas and educational facilities. It was good. It was maybe the best individual work I'd ever done. The presentation went well. The outside critics responded positively. One of them, an established architect from a major firm in New York, specifically complimented my integration of technical and conceptual thinking. I felt, for the first time since Harrison's death, like maybe I could actually do this. Maybe I could have a career as an architect even without my partner. Then, 3 days later, I overheard a conversation in the studio. 2 students I didn't know well were talking in low voices. not realizing I was at a drafting table just around the corner. "Did you hear about Adrian's Cultural Center project?" one of them said. "The one that got all the praise from the critics?" "Yeah. Cameron said it's basically a refined version of something Harrison designed before he died. Said Adrian's been mining Harrison's old sketchbooks for ideas." My hands froze on my drafting pencil. "That's fucked up," the other student said. "Like, I get that they were partners, but taking a dead guy's work and presenting it as your own?" "Cameron said he's seen the original sketches. Said Harrison showed them to him last year." That was a lie. A complete, calculated lie. Harrison had never shown Cameron our work. Cameron hadn't even been friendly with Harrison. The Cultural Center design was entirely mine. Harrison and I had never discussed anything remotely similar. But it was a lie that was impossible to definitively disprove. Harrison was dead. He couldn't confirm or deny anything. And Cameron had positioned himself as someone who'd been closer to Harrison than he actually was, someone who had special knowledge of Harrison's creative process. I stood up and walked around the corner. "That's not true," I said. Both students looked startled. One of them, Evan something, I think his last name was Rivera, had the decency to look embarrassed. "I didn't mean," he started. "Harrison never designed anything like my cultural center," I said. "Cameron is lying." "Hey man, I'm just telling you what I heard," Evan said defensively. "Take it up with Cameron if you have a problem." I found Cameron in the library an hour later. He was working on his own project, surrounded by books and reference materials, looking utterly absorbed in his work. "We need to talk," said. He looked up, eyebrows raised in apparent surprise. "About what?" "About you telling people I stole Harrison's work." Cameron's expression shifted into something that looked like concern, but I could see the calculation behind it. "Adrian, I never said you stole anything. I just mentioned to a couple people that your cultural center design reminded me of some concepts Harrison had talked about. I thought it was a nice tribute, actually." "Harrison never designed anything like my cultural center. Maybe not exactly like it, but the spatial organization, the way you integrated the performance spaces with the community areas. Harrison and I had talked about similar ideas last year." "You barely knew Harrison," Cameron shrugged. "We talked more than you probably realized. He was friendly with everyone." He paused, then added, with a sympathetic tone that made my skin crawl, "Look, I get it. You miss him. We all do. And there's nothing wrong with being inspired by your partner's work. Just own it, you know? Don't get defensive." That was the genius of it. He'd positioned his lie in such a way that my denial only made me look more suspicious, more defensive, more like someone trying to hide something. I walked away before I said something I'd regret. Over the next several months, the rumor metastasized. It wasn't that everyone believed it. Many students and faculty members either didn't hear it or didn't give it much weight. But enough people heard it and believed it to fundamentally change my experience in the program. I started noticing that I got fewer invitations to study groups and collaborative projects. When I contributed ideas in studio discussions, they were received more skeptically than before. Professors who'd previously been enthusiastic about my work now seemed more reserved, more questioning. The worst part was that I couldn't fight it effectively. The rumor was vague enough, spread through enough indirect channels, that there was no single source to confront or refute. Cameron was careful never to make direct accusations. He just asked questions, made observations, let other people draw their own conclusions. I wonder if Adrian's latest project was influenced by Harrison's sketches. It's interesting how Adrian's work has evolved since Harrison passed. I'm sure Harrison would be proud of how Adrian is carrying on their shared vision. Every statement was carefully worded to be defensible as innocent speculation or genuine sympathy, while simultaneously reinforcing the narrative that my success was derivative, that I was riding on Harrison's legacy rather than creating my own work. I tried to focus on the work itself, to let my designs speak for themselves. I produced good projects throughout my third year, projects that were entirely, demonstrably my own, but I could never fully escape the shadow of doubt that Cameron had cast. By the spring of my third year, I was socially isolated, professionally undermined, and emotionally exhausted. I started avoiding the studio, working at odd hours when fewer people were around. I stopped attending department social events and networking opportunities. I was becoming exactly what Cameron had suggested I was: the technical guy, the support player, someone without the vision or charisma to succeed on his own terms. The breaking point came at the end of my third year, during our spring design expo. Each student was required to present their semester's work to a panel of outside professionals, potential employers, established architects, industry leaders. It was our opportunity to make connections, get feedback, potentially line up internships or job offers. I'd spent weeks preparing my presentation. I'd designed a community center for a low-income neighborhood, focusing on creating flexible spaces that could serve multiple functions and adapt to community needs over time. It was thoughtful, well-researched, technically sophisticated, but when I presented it to the panel, I made a critical mistake. I tried to explain the work in technical terms: the structural system, the material choices, the spatial efficiency. I focused on problem solving and functionality. I presented it the way I would have presented it to Harrison, knowing he would understand the creative thinking behind the technical decisions, but Harrison wasn't there to translate my technical precision into emotional resonance. And I didn't know how to do it myself. The panel members nodded politely. They asked a few questions about my structural calculations and building code compliance. They thanked me for my time. Then Cameron presented. His project was a luxury hotel with a dramatically sculptural facade. It was visually striking but spatially inefficient, with floor plates that would be nightmarishly difficult to plan and structural challenges that he'd glossed over in his presentation. But Cameron didn't talk about the technical problems. He talked about experience and emotion and transformation. He showed renderings of people enjoying the spaces, described the journey a guest would take through the building, explained how the design would become an iconic landmark that drew visitors and elevated the surrounding neighborhood. The panel loved it. They asked enthusiastic questions about his design philosophy and career aspirations. One of them handed Cameron a business card and told him to reach out about summer internship opportunities. As I watched Cameron charm the panel with a project that was half as functional as mine, but twice as compelling in presentation, I realized something devastating. Harrison hadn't just been my creative partner, he'd been my translator, the person who could take my technical thinking and turn it into inspiration. Without him, I was just a guy who was good at solving problems. And in the world of architecture, that wasn't enough. I graduated on time, but barely. My fourth year was an exercise in going through the motions. I completed my required projects, maintained an acceptable GPA, showed up for critiques and presentations. But the passion was gone. I didn't attend commencement. I didn't see the point. My parents offered to drive down for the ceremony, but I told them not to bother. It was a long drive, and I had job interviews to prepare for. I didn't actually have job interviews. I just didn't want them to see how far I'd fallen from the confident, ambitious person who'd started the program 4 years earlier. Cameron, meanwhile, thrived. He graduated with honors, won a department award for design excellence, and lined up a position at a prestigious firm in Chicago. At the graduation reception I didn't attend, he apparently gave a speech about pursuing your vision and not letting obstacles or doubts hold you back. I heard about it from a former classmate who emailed me the details, thinking I'd want to know. I didn't. After graduation, I moved to a cheap apartment in Philadelphia and took a job at a mid-sized architecture firm that specialized in commercial interiors, office build-outs, retail spaces, restaurant renovations. It was steady work that paid enough to cover my student loans and living expenses, but it had nothing to do with the kind of transformative design Harrison and I had dreamed about. My role was essentially technical support. I produced construction documents, coordinated with contractors, solved spatial planning problems. I was competent at it, but it required none of the creative vision that had once driven me. My coworkers were friendly enough, but I didn't form real friendships with any of them. After work, I went home to my apartment and worked on paying down my debt. On weekends, I ran errands and caught up on sleep. I stopped following architecture news and industry publications. I stopped sketching in my spare time. I put Harrison's box of materials in my closet and didn't open it. For nearly 2 years, I lived like this, functional but hollow, employed but not engaged, alive but not really living. My parents called occasionally to check in. I told them I was doing fine, that the job was going well, that Philadelphia was a good city. They seemed to believe me, or at least they wanted to badly enough not to push for details. On the second anniversary of Harrison's death, I drove to a liquor store, bought a bottle of decent whiskey, and sat in my apartment drinking it, while looking through our old project files on my laptop. The riverfront project was there, still comprehensive and ambitious and full of potential. I looked at the renderings, the planning documents, the detailed drawings we'd produced together. I thought about what might have been if Harrison had lived, if we'd opened our firm, if we'd actually built something meaningful. Then I closed the laptop and finished the whiskey. The change started small, almost accidentally. My firm was hired to design the interior renovation of a struggling independent bookstore. The owners had a limited budget and a tight timeline, and they weren't sure what they actually wanted beyond something that draws more customers. Most of my coworkers saw it as a low-priority project, a small job for a client who couldn't pay much. It got assigned to me because nobody else wanted it. I met with the owners, a married couple in their 50s who'd run the bookstore for 20 years, and were watching it slowly die as people shifted to online shopping and e-readers. They loved books, loved their community, but they didn't know how to compete anymore. For the first time in 2 years, I actually cared about a project. I spent time in the bookstore, watching how people moved through the space, noticing where they lingered and where they rushed past. I talked to regular customers about what they valued in the store. I researched successful independent bookstores in other cities to see what strategies were working. Then I designed a renovation that transformed the bookstore from a purely commercial space into a community hub. I created a cafe area with comfortable seating that encouraged people to stay longer. I redesigned the layout to improve sightlines and create distinct zones for different types of books. I added flexible event space that could host readings, book clubs, and community meetings. The budget was tiny, so I focused on high-impact, low-cost interventions, better lighting, reconfigured shelving, strategic paint colors, improved signage. When we presented the design to the owners, they cried. "This is exactly what we needed," the wife said. "Not just what we asked for, what we actually needed." The renovation was completed in 6 weeks. Within 3 months, the bookstore's revenue had increased by 30%. Within 6 months, it had become a neighborhood destination, featured in local publications as an example of how independent bookstores could thrive in the digital age. My firm's principal called me into his office. "The bookstore owners have been telling everyone about you," he said. "We're getting inquiries from other small businesses that want similar work. I'm thinking we could develop this into a specialty service, strategic design for small businesses and nonprofits." He asked if I'd be interested in leading it. I said yes. Over the next year, I built a reputation. I took on projects that other architects dismissed as too small or too constrained. Community centers with minimal budgets, nonprofit offices in difficult spaces, independent retailers competing with chains. I approached each project not as a design problem, but as a strategic problem. How could architecture help this organization succeed? I talked to users and stakeholders. I researched comparable organizations and studied their successes and failures. I developed designs that were functional, beautiful, and tailored to specific operational needs and constraints. I was good at it, maybe better than I'd ever been at anything. The work wasn't glamorous. I wasn't designing iconic cultural landmarks or luxury residential towers, but I was creating spaces that genuinely improved people's lives and helped organizations succeed. And I was learning something Harrison had never taught me: how to listen to clients, how to understand business strategy, how to integrate design with operational and financial reality. I started attending real estate development conferences, learning about project financing and market analysis. I took courses in business management and organizational strategy. I studied how successful developers identified opportunities and structured deals. I was rebuilding myself, but not as the architect I'd originally imagined becoming. I was becoming something else, someone who understood how design, business, and strategy intersected. After 2 years of running the small business design program at my firm, I left to start my own consultancy, not an architecture firm, a strategic development consultancy that helped small-scale developers and community organizations plan and finance projects. I hired architects and designers to work for me. I focused on the strategy, the financing, the deal structure. I was good at it because I understood design deeply enough to know what was possible and what was worth pursuing, but I approached it as a business problem rather than a creative problem. The consultancy succeeded. Within 3 years, I'd built a small but respected firm that specialized in community-focused development projects. We weren't doing the kind of transformative urban design Harrison and I had dreamed about, but we were doing good work that made real impacts. I was making good money. I was building a professional reputation. I was proving that I could succeed on my own terms, but I still thought about Cameron Prescott. I didn't obsess over Cameron's career, but I stayed aware of it. It was easy enough. He was good at self-promotion, and the architecture media loved his work. After several years at the Chicago firm, Cameron struck out on his own. He opened Prescott Architecture in downtown Chicago, with backing from wealthy clients who'd been impressed by his residential projects. His firm specialized in high-end, visually dramatic work: luxury homes, boutique hotels, upscale retail spaces, the kind of projects that photographed beautifully and won design awards, but often had significant budget overruns and functionality issues. Cameron positioned himself as a visionary, an artist, someone who pushed boundaries and challenged conventions. He gave TED-style talks about the future of architecture. He was featured in design magazines and industry publications. He was successful in exactly the way he'd always wanted to be: famous within the industry, respected by clients with money, celebrated for his bold creative vision. And he'd built it all on the foundation of undermining me, of taking the narrative that should have been Adrian and Harrison, promising young architects, and turning it into Cameron Prescott, rising star, and Adrian, the technical guy who couldn't make it without his partner. I followed his career through industry publications and social media. I watched him grow his firm, take on bigger projects, win more awards, and I waited. The opportunity came 7 years after graduation. I was running a successful development consultancy by then, with a staff of 12 and a portfolio of completed projects that had won praise for their community impact and financial sustainability. I'd transitioned from consulting to active development investment, putting together financing packages and taking equity positions in projects I believed in. I'd built something real. I had money, credibility, and a network of relationships with investors, lenders, and development partners. And then I saw the announcement. Cameron Prescott had unveiled plans for the Riverfront District, a major mixed-use development on a former industrial waterfront in Cleveland. The renderings and concept descriptions were released with significant media fanfare. The project looked remarkably familiar. It wasn't an exact copy of the riverfront project Harrison and I had designed in school. Cameron was too smart for that. But the core concept was unmistakable: the integration of residential, commercial, and public space, the preservation of historical industrial structures, the emphasis on creating community-oriented street life, the sustainable infrastructure systems. He'd taken our vision, refined it for a real-world site, and was presenting it as his own original concept. The announcement mentioned that Cameron was still securing financing for the project, which was estimated to cost $180 million. He had initial commitments from several investors, but was looking for additional capital partners. I read the announcement 3 times, studying the renderings, comparing them mentally to the project Harrison and I had spent months developing. Then I picked up my phone and called my lawyer. I had my attorney reach out to Cameron's firm through official channels, not as Adrian making a personal approach, but as Harlow Development Group expressing interest in discussing potential investment partnership. That was the name of my development firm. I'd chosen Harlow from the white list of surnames, specifically because it was professional, memorable, and completely disconnected from my personal identity. Most people in the industry knew me as Adrian, the principal of Harlow Development Group, but they didn't make the connection to the Adrian who'd studied architecture with Cameron Prescott. 7 years, professional success, and a slightly different context had been enough to obscure the connection. Cameron's firm responded enthusiastically. They were actively seeking development partners for the Riverfront District project, and Harlow Development Group had exactly the kind of track record they were looking for: successful community-focused projects with strong financial returns. We scheduled an initial meeting at Cameron's Chicago office. I flew to Chicago on a Tuesday morning in October. I'd carefully prepared for this meeting, rehearsing not just what I'd say, but how I'd carry myself, what signals I'd send. I needed Cameron to see me as a serious investor and potential partner, not as Adrian from architecture school. I wore an expensive suit, carried a leather portfolio, and arrived exactly on time. Cameron's office was in a converted industrial building in the West Loop: exposed brick, high ceilings, carefully curated furniture that balanced modern and vintage. His personal office had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. He greeted me with a confident smile and a firm handshake. If he recognized me, he gave no indication. Why would he? The last time he'd seen me, I was a defeated architecture student taking a dead-end job. Now I was a successful development professional with a track record of completed projects and investment capital. 7 years and professional success had transformed me into someone Cameron wouldn't expect to encounter. "Adrian," he said, gesturing to a seating area with a view of the river. "Thanks for making the trip. I've been following Harlow Development's work. Impressive portfolio." "Thank you," I said, settling into one of his architect-designed chairs. "Your Riverfront District project caught my attention. It's an ambitious concept." Cameron's eyes lit up the way they always did when someone praised his work. "It's a passion project," he said. "I've been developing the concept for years, waiting for the right opportunity and the right site. Cleveland's waterfront has incredible potential that's been completely neglected." "I'd love to hear more about the concept development," I said. "The integration of historical preservation with new construction is particularly interesting." Cameron spent the next 45 minutes walking me through the project: the site analysis, the design philosophy, the phasing strategy, the market positioning. He showed me renderings, floor plans, financial projections. It was all professionally done, thoroughly developed, and undeniably derivative of the work Harrison and I had created. But I didn't mention that. I asked informed questions about market demand, construction costs, financing structure. I positioned myself as someone who was interested in the project's financial viability, not its design origins. "What's your current funding situation?" I asked. Cameron's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. We have preliminary commitments for about 60% of the required capital. We're actively seeking partners for the remaining amount. What's the gap? Roughly $72 million. I nodded, making a note in my portfolio. That's substantial. What's your timeline for securing the additional funding? We'd like to close within 6 months. We have site control, but we need to move forward, or we'll lose momentum. Understood. I closed my portfolio and leaned back. I'm interested. Harlow Development Group could potentially structure a financing package that covers the gap, but I'd need to conduct thorough due diligence first. Your team would need to provide complete access to all project documentation, market research, and financial modeling. Of course, Cameron said. I'll have my team prepare everything. We shook hands and I left his office. I walked 3 blocks before I allowed myself to feel anything. Then I stood on a street corner in downtown Chicago, watching cars pass, and let myself acknowledge what was actually happening. I was going to do this. I was going to help Cameron build his project. And I was going to do it in a way that would destroy him more thoroughly than any public accusation or professional confrontation ever could. The due diligence process took 4 months. My team examined every aspect of the Riverfront District project: market studies, financial projections, construction cost estimates, environmental assessments, zoning approvals. We interviewed the general contractor, toured the site, met with city officials. Cameron's team provided everything we requested with minimal resistance. They were eager to close the funding gap, and Harlow Development Group's reputation gave them confidence that we were serious partners. Throughout the process, I maintained perfect professional distance. I never mentioned architecture school or Harrison, or the fact that I'd once designed something remarkably similar to Cameron's vision. I was just a development professional evaluating an investment opportunity. But I was also documenting everything: every design drawing, every concept description, every piece of marketing material that described the project's vision and philosophy. I compiled it all, dated it, archived it, and in parallel I had my attorney quietly gathering documentation of the original Riverfront project from my architecture school days, Professor Davenport's old course files, time-stamped digital submissions, Harrison's and my names on project documentation. I wasn't gathering evidence for a lawsuit. I was gathering leverage. The financing agreement took 6 weeks to negotiate. My attorney drafted a comprehensive contract that covered equity participation, decision-making authority, intellectual property rights, and various contingencies. It was long, nearly 80 pages of detailed clauses and subclauses. Cameron's attorney reviewed it, requested some modifications to provisions about creative control and design authority, and approved the final version. The intellectual property section was buried on page 47, in language that was technical but standard for development agreements. It established that all design concepts, branding, and derivative development rights for the Riverfront District project and any related developments would be held by a joint entity controlled by the primary financial partner, which was Harlow Development Group. In practice, this meant that while Cameron maintained creative control over the initial project's design and execution, I controlled the underlying concept and any future applications of it. Cameron's attorney flagged this section and asked for clarification. I explained that it was a standard provision to protect my investment. If Cameron's firm dissolved or he decided to pursue other opportunities, Harlow Development Group needed assurance that we could continue developing the concept with other architects. It made sense from an investor's perspective. It was reasonable. It was what any sophisticated development partner would require. Cameron signed. The money transferred. Construction began. The Riverfront District project was officially underway. The project took 3 years to complete. During that time, I maintained my role as the financial partner and strategic advisor. I attended quarterly meetings, reviewed progress reports, and provided input on major decisions. but I let Cameron remain the public face of the project. He was the one giving interviews to architecture publications, speaking at industry conferences, getting his photo taken at construction milestones. He positioned himself as the visionary architect who was transforming Cleveland's waterfront, and the project was successful. Despite some budget overruns and timeline delays, inevitable with a project of this scale, the development was well executed and well received. The first residential units sold quickly. The retail spaces attracted interesting tenants. The public areas became popular destinations for both residents and visitors. Cameron won awards. He was profiled in major architecture magazines. The Riverfront District was featured in case studies and conference presentations as an example of successful urban revitalization. His firm grew on the strength of this success. He hired more staff, took on bigger projects, expanded his national reputation. I watched all of this happen while quietly building documentation of the project's success and market value. The conversation about expansion happened in the third year of the project's operation. By then, the Riverfront District was an established success, generating strong returns and attracting attention from developers in other cities who wanted to replicate the model. Cameron called me to propose an expansion strategy. Other waterfront cities were expressing interest in similar developments. He'd been approached by officials in Baltimore, Detroit, and Providence about applying the Riverfront District concept to sites in their cities. This could be a franchise model, Cameron said during a conference call with his development team. The Riverfront District isn't just one project, it's a scalable approach to waterfront revitalization. That's an interesting opportunity, I said, but it would require formal licensing of the development concept and brand. Right, Cameron said. I'm thinking we establish a separate entity that licenses the concept and provides design services for new projects. My firm would lead the design work, and Harlow Development Group could participate in the financing for projects where it makes sense. That would require us to establish clear ownership of the intellectual property, I said. The development concept, the brand, the design approach, all of it would need to be properly registered and protected before we can license it to other projects. Cameron agreed enthusiastically. This was a growth opportunity for his firm, a chance to expand beyond individual projects into a repeatable model. Let's have our attorneys work out the details, he said. The intellectual property registration process was straightforward. Based on the financing agreement Cameron had signed 3 years earlier, Harlow Development Group owned the rights to the Riverfront District concept and any derivative developments. This was exactly what Cameron had agreed to. He'd just never thought carefully about what it actually meant. My attorney filed formal registrations for the development concept, the branding, and the design approach. We created detailed documentation showing how these elements formed a comprehensive intellectual property package. Cameron's attorney reviewed everything and signed off. From his perspective, this was just formalizing what had already been agreed to. Cameron maintained creative control over the design execution, so he wasn't concerned about the underlying ownership structure. But what Cameron didn't fully grasp, or perhaps didn't think carefully about, was that once the IP was formally registered under Harlow Development Group's ownership, he didn't have the right to use it for other projects without my permission. The original Cleveland project was built under the existing agreement, but any expansion, any licensing, any derivative projects, those would all require licensing agreements from me, and I was under no obligation to grant them. The meeting where Cameron realized what he'd done was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in late September. He'd requested it to discuss the licensing structure for the Baltimore and Detroit projects, both of which had advanced from preliminary interest to serious development proposals. We met in a conference room at Harlow Development Group's offices in Philadelphia. Cameron flew in from Chicago with his attorney and his development director. I had my attorney and my CFO with me. Cameron was in good spirits, energized by the expansion opportunities. He spent the first 15 minutes describing the Baltimore project, the site, the market conditions, the local political support. The mayor's office is very supportive, he said. They see this as a catalytic project for their waterfront revitalization strategy. It sounds promising, I said. Let's talk about the licensing structure. I nodded to my attorney, who slid a document across the table. This is the standard licensing agreement for projects using the Riverfront District IP, my attorney said. It establishes Harlow Development Group as the licensor and outlines the terms for using the concept in new developments. Cameron's attorney picked up the document and began reading. His expression shifted from casual interest to concentration to concern. This gives Harlow Development Group complete control over the concept, he said, not just for financing purposes, actual ownership. That's correct, my attorney said, as established in the original financing agreement for the Cleveland project. Cameron looked confused. Wait, I thought we were partners. We developed the Cleveland project together. You developed the design and managed the execution, I said. Harlow Development Group provided the financing and owns the underlying concept. But it's my concept, Cameron said. I created the Riverfront District vision. I looked at him across the conference table. Did you? I asked. There was a moment of silence. I've been developing this approach for years, Cameron said. His voice had an edge now, defensive. Have you? I asked again. I opened the folder in front of me and removed a set of documents. I slid them across the table. These are from an architecture school project completed 9 years ago, I said. A comprehensive urban design concept for transforming an industrial waterfront into a mixed-use district. Notice the design philosophy, the integration strategy, the emphasis on preserving historical character while creating new community spaces. Cameron stared at the documents. I watched the color drain from his face as he recognized what he was seeing. This project was developed by 2 architecture students, I continued. Harrison Caldwell and Adrian Whitfield. Adrian Whitfield being me, in case that wasn't clear. Cameron's attorney was speed-reading the documents, his expression growing more concerned. The Riverfront District concept isn't yours, I said. It was Harrison's and mine. You saw it in school, you recognized its potential, and you waited until you had the credibility and the client base to execute it, but you never actually owned it. This is, Cameron started then stopped. His attorney had put a hand on his arm. That was academic work, Cameron's attorney said. Student projects. That doesn't establish commercial intellectual property rights. You're correct, my attorney said. The original academic project doesn't directly establish commercial IP rights. However, the financing agreement Mr. Prescott signed 3 years ago does establish those rights. The question of who originally developed the concept is relevant to understanding what Mr. Prescott actually signed away. Cameron looked at me with an expression I'd seen before, the same calculating look he'd had 7 years ago when he was spreading rumors about me. You planned this, he said. The whole partnership, the financing, it was all set up. I provided financing for a development project, I said. You signed a contract. The contract was clear about the intellectual property terms. I never would have signed if you'd understood that you were signing away ownership of a concept you'd taken from someone else, I asked. You're right. You probably wouldn't have. Cameron's attorney requested a recess. They spent 20 minutes in a separate conference room, presumably reviewing the original financing agreement and trying to find a way out. When they returned, Cameron looked like a different person. The confident architect was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened. What do you want? He asked. I don't want anything from you, I said. I already have what I need. So this is revenge, Cameron said. For what? For architecture? Or school? That was years ago? Do you remember Harrison Caldwell? I asked. Cameron hesitated. Of course, he died in a car accident. He was my best friend, I said. We were partners. We designed the riverfront project together. It was going to be the foundation for the firm we planned to open. I leaned forward. And after he died, you spread rumors that I was stealing his work, that I was just technical support without any real creative vision. You undermined my reputation. You isolated me professionally. You built your career while making sure I couldn't build mine. That's not... Cameron started. Don't, I said. We both know exactly what you did. I pulled out another document from my folder. This is the licensing agreement for the Baltimore project, I said. Under the terms we're offering, Harlow Development Group will take a significant equity position and ongoing royalty payments. Your firm will provide design services as a contractor, but you won't own any part of the project. We'll hire you to execute the vision, but it won't be your vision anymore. You can't do this, Cameron said. I can, I said. You signed a contract that gives me exactly this authority. Your attorney can confirm. Cameron's attorney nodded reluctantly. The IP provisions are clear. Harlow Development Group does have the rights they're claiming. So my options are what? Cameron asked. Accept these terms or walk away from the expansion entirely. Those are your options for the Baltimore and Detroit projects, I said. But there's another issue we need to discuss. I slid another document across the table. This is a retrospective licensing agreement for the original Cleveland project. It clarifies that while you maintain operational control over the existing development, the brand, the concept, and any future modifications or expansions are owned by Harlow Development Group. The Cleveland project is already built, Cameron said. Yes, I said, but it's generating ongoing value. The brand has equity. The success of the project is what's driving interest from Baltimore and Detroit and other cities. That brand value belongs to Harlow Development Group, as established in our original agreement. You want me to sign over the project I built, Cameron said. I want you to acknowledge what you already signed over, I said. The Cleveland project can continue operating exactly as it is. Your firm can continue managing it. But the intellectual property, the brand, the concept, those are mine. Cameron stared at me. I could see him working through the implications, understanding that he'd built his biggest success on a foundation he never actually owned. You've been planning this for years, he said. I've been building a business for years, I said. I've been successful. I have capital and credibility and the ability to structure deals that serve my interests. This is just business. This isn't business, Cameron said. This is personal. Allowed myself a slight smile. It can be both, I said. Cameron tried to negotiate. His attorney tried to find loopholes. They requested modifications, proposed alternatives, attempted to restructure the agreements in ways that would preserve Cameron's ownership stake. But the fundamental reality was inescapable. Cameron had signed a comprehensive financing agreement that gave Harlow Development Group control over the intellectual property. The agreement was legally sound, professionally drafted, and thoroughly reviewed by his own attorney at the time. The only question was whether Cameron would accept the licensing terms I was offering or walk away from the expansion opportunities entirely. After 3 hours of discussion and 2 more recesses, Cameron signed. He signed the retrospective licensing agreement for the Cleveland project, acknowledging Harlow Development Group's ownership of the underlying concept and brand. He signed the licensing agreement for the Baltimore project, accepting a position as design contractor rather than concept owner. He signed a framework agreement that established terms for any future projects using the Riverfront District approach. In each agreement, Cameron's firm would be paid for design services. Good money, fair compensation for their work, but they wouldn't own what they were designing. They wouldn't control the brand they'd built. They wouldn't have equity in the projects they were creating. Cameron Prescott, the visionary architect who'd built his reputation on the Riverfront District concept, had just become a hired contractor executing someone else's vision. When the signing was complete, Cameron sat back in his chair and looked at me. "You know what the worst part is?" he said. "What's that?" I asked. I actually believed my own narrative. I convinced myself that the riverfront district was my original concept, that I'd developed it independently. I forgot that it came from you and Harrison. "Memory is selective," I said. "Is this going to be public?" he asked. "Are you going to announce that I stole the concept?" "No, I said. "There's no reason to. You'll continue working on these projects. Your firm will be credited for the design work. The only difference is who owns the underlying concept." "Why not?" Cameron asked. "Why not destroy my reputation publicly if you hate me this much?" "Because I don't need to," I said. "You'll know. Every time you work on a riverfront district project, every time you present designs based on this concept, every time you see your name as the architect of record, you'll know that you're executing Harrison's and my vision. You'll know that you built your career on something you took from us, and then you signed it away." I stood up and gathered my documents. "That's worse than any public accusation could be," I said. "Living with what you know about yourself." Cameron didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the signed agreements on the conference table. I walked out of the meeting without looking back. The Baltimore and Detroit projects moved forward. Cameron's firm provided excellent design services, translating the riverfront district concept to new sites with local sensitivity and technical sophistication. The projects were successful. They won awards. They generated positive press coverage. Cameron Prescott's name appeared on all of it, credited as the lead architect. Industry publications praised his work. He gave interviews about the design process and the challenges of waterfront revitalization, but he never owned any of it. Harlow Development Group held the intellectual property rights. We controlled the brand. We collected the licensing fees and the equity returns from each project's success. Cameron earned good money as a design contractor. His firm remained financially stable and professionally respected. But he'd gone from being the visionary behind a transformative development concept to being a hired service provider, executing someone else's vision, and everyone who mattered in the development world knew it. Investors and developers who were interested in riverfront district projects came to Harlow Development Group first, not to Cameron's firm. We decided which projects moved forward, which sites were selected, which architects got hired. Sometimes we hired Cameron's firm. Sometimes we didn't. Cameron never complained publicly. He never talked about the intellectual property arrangements or the ownership structure. He maintained his professional reputation and continued designing good projects. But I know what it cost him. I know because I made sure he was invited to every major meeting, every project milestone, every award ceremony. I made sure he had to show up and smile and accept credit for work he didn't own, while knowing exactly what he'd given away. 3 years after the signing, I was at an industry conference in New York when I ran into Melanie Harlow, one of my former classmates from architecture school. We'd kept in loose contact over the years, occasional emails, LinkedIn connections, the kind of distant professional relationship that survives after graduation. "Adrian," she said, spotting me in the hotel lobby between sessions. "I didn't know you were here." "Business development," I said. "Harlow Development Group is looking at some opportunities in New York." "I saw your firm's been behind those riverfront district projects," she said. "That's impressive work. Must be satisfying to see that concept finally getting built after all these years." "It is," I said. "I remember when you and Harrison first developed that in school," she said. "Professor Davenport used to tell people it was one of the best student projects he'd ever seen." "It was a long time ago," I said. Melanie looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I also remember what happened after Harrison died," she said. "The rumors, the way people treated you, that must have been awful." "It was," I said. "Cameron Prescott's doing well for himself," she said. The way she said his name made it clear she understood more than she was saying directly. I saw him speak at a panel this morning about the evolution of waterfront development. Very polished presentation. He's a good presenter, I said. He talked a lot about the importance of original vision and creative authorship, Melanie said. Interesting choice of themes, given the circumstances. I didn't respond. Melanie studied me for a moment. Are you happy, Adrian? She asked. The question caught me off guard. I'm successful, I said. That's not what I asked. I thought about the question. I thought about my firm, my completed projects, my financial success. I thought about the contracts Cameron had signed, the ownership structure that gave me control over the concept he'd tried to claim. I did what I needed to do, I said. I'm sure you did, Melanie said. But that's still not what I asked. She touched my arm gently. Take care of yourself, Adrian, she said. Then she walked away to join a group of other architects heading to the next session. I stood in the hotel lobby, surrounded by industry professionals networking and discussing projects, and I realized I didn't have a good answer to her question. I'm telling you this story from my office at Harlow Development Group, 8 years after Cameron signed those agreements. The Riverfront District concept has been implemented in 6 cities now. Each project has been successful. Each one has generated strong returns for investors and positive outcomes for communities. Cameron's firm has provided design services for 4 of those 6 projects. He's made good money from the work. His firm has grown. His reputation as a skilled architect remains intact, but he doesn't own what he's building. He works for me now, whether he admits it or not, and I think about that every single day. I think about Harrison, who would be 33 years old now if he'd lived. I think about the firm we would have built together, the projects we would have designed, the impact we might have had on the field. I think about the 2 years I spent defeated and isolated, believing I was exactly what Cameron's rumors suggested. Technical support without vision, the lesser half of a partnership. I think about the satisfaction I felt when Cameron realized what he'd signed away, when he understood that he'd built his success on a foundation he never actually owned. And I think about Melanie's question, are you happy? I'm not sure I know how to be happy anymore. I'm successful, I'm respected, I'm financially secure. I've proven that I can build something meaningful without Harrison. I've gotten revenge on the person who tried to destroy my career, but I'm also alone. I have business relationships, professional connections, employees and partners and clients. But I don't have friends. I don't have anyone I trust completely, anyone I'm building. Something with the way I built things with Harrison, because I learned, through years of isolation and strategic calculation, that trusting people is dangerous, that partnerships can be destroyed, that the people who seem most supportive can become your worst enemies. I learned to be self-sufficient, to rely only on myself, to structure relationships through contracts and legal agreements rather than trust and shared vision. Those lessons made me successful. They also made me isolated. There's a box in my closet at home, the box Harrison's mother gave me after his funeral. It contains his sketchbooks, his drafting tools, and the flash drive with our shared project files. I haven't opened it in 8 years. Sometimes I think about opening it, about looking through Harrison's sketches and remembering what it felt like to design something purely out of passion and vision. Before I learned to think about intellectual property rights and ownership structures and strategic leverage, but I don't open it, because I know what I'd find there, a reminder of who I used to be, before the revenge, before the isolation, before I turned into someone who sees every relationship as a potential contract, and every conversation as a negotiation. Cameron Prescott tried to destroy my career by spreading rumors and undermining my reputation. He succeeded for a while. He took something from me that I can never get back, those years of confidence and creative partnership, the sense that I could build something meaningful with someone I trusted. So I took something from him in return. I took his greatest success and turned it into a reminder that he never owned what he'd built. I made him live with the knowledge that every riverfront district project he works on is really mine and Harrison's vision, executed under my control. It's perfect revenge. It's strategic, irreversible, and entirely nonviolent. It's exactly what I designed it to be, and it's changed me in ways I'll never recover from. The box is still in my closet. Harrison's sketches are still on that flash drive. The vision we shared is still out there, being built in cities across the country, generating returns and positive outcomes. But Harrison is still dead, I'm still alone, and Cameron Prescott is still executing our vision while knowing he signed away any claim to it. That's what revenge looks like when you build it carefully, patiently, with absolute clarity about what you're really doing and what it will cost you. I won. I proved I could succeed without Harrison. I made Cameron pay for what he tried to do to me. And I'll live with what that victory required me to become for the rest of my life. I'm telling you this story because I want you to understand something important. Revenge isn't about anger or vindication or public confrontation. Real revenge is about patience and leverage, and understanding exactly what someone values most. But I also want you to understand the cost. I built a successful career. I proved my capabilities. I got justice for what Cameron tried to do to me and Harrison's memory. And in the process, I became someone who can structure a perfect contract, but can't remember the last time I trusted someone enough to call them a friend. That's the blueprint. That's what it looks like when you build revenge with the same careful precision you'd use to design a building, perfect in execution, permanent in impact, and absolutely devastating to the person you used to be. Stories like this happen more often than we think. Subscribe if you want to hear the ones that usually stay unspoken. And if this story made you pause, a like helps the channel grow.